Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. My name is Jerome Fletcher. On behalf of the County Executive Mark Elrich, I am an Assistant Chief Administrative Officer in the Office of the County Executive. I want to welcome you to the second Economic Recovery and Revitalization Town Hall. We have a great list of panelists today and a lot of information that we want to discuss with you, and we also want to hear from you. So we're going to go ahead and get started. I do want to start off the call by saying that we do have Dr. Stoddard with us. We will not have Dr. Gales with us, and I want to go over some health information so that everyone can know where we are and where we stand as a county. As of yesterday, we had an increase of 465 cases from the prior day. We have an average of 307 new cases daily over the last 7 days. Our 7-day average per 100,000 residents is 29.3. To put that in perspective, our target is 5. And to put the 307 new cases into perspective, we want it to be around 40 to 50 as we decide on how to relax activities. Our numbers are just way too high. And if Dr. Gales were here, he would also echo the sentiment of us telling everyone to please stay safe and stay home during the Thanksgiving holiday next week. It's important. Please take heed and practice as much safety as you can. I do want to talk about a couple of grant applications that are live this week. We do know and understand that financial relief is at the top of the relief that we can provide as a county right now, especially since we are restricting our activities based on safety and health. The Tourism Anchor Institution Grant Program went live on November 19th. It is a non-public facility program. $5 million is what we expect to spend by the end of the year. Our partners at MCEDC launched a restaurant relief grant program this week. That was part of the governor's $250 million. They set aside $50 million for restaurants. Montgomery County received $8.2 million of that, and 7.9 will go for this program. $400,000 of this amount of money from the state was allocated towards EDC's pre-existing 3R program, which also was set to serve restaurants as well. The program that is now live for the restaurant relief, it will also serve caterers, food trucks, franchises that are locally owned, wineries and breweries. There was a very broad amount of latitude given to us, and we took advantage of that and made sure that we could get this grant program administered to as many people as possible. It will be a lottery program. It is not first come, first served. So we do want you to make sure that you please try to take advantage of it. Please get the word out so that you can get some financial relief. You can apply for multiple programs. You just cannot get reimbursed for the same expense 2 times. So as long as you are getting reimbursed for a new program, that is totally within the rules. We also have a primary care and dental grant program that is being administered by the Primary Care Coalition. It launched this week. They have already received over 200 applications. That program will make sure that you can get, I think it's up to $35,000 for the primary care and 10 or 15 for the dental businesses as well. The Reopening Montgomery grant program is still available. A lot of you are already familiar with that one. Please be aware that we're still accepting applications to that program. We have repurposed some of that money for the Tourism Anchor program, but we still have money available for the Reopening Grant Program. It is just a reimbursement type basis. The only tweak that we are making in order to get that money out faster is we are pulling the lottery and pulling a lot more of them so the money can be distributed by the end of the year. So those are all the programs that are live this week in Montgomery County. Please visit our business website on our county page, and you will be able to see all of those programs as well as apply to them if you are truly applicable for what they provide. Earlier in the week, we do know that the governor had a press conference and he made some new restrictions for the state. Luckily, the county was already involved in a lot of those efforts, so we didn't have to change too much except for the fact that as of today at 5 p.m., restaurants are required to close at 10 p.m. That is a huge change from the overall operation that we were working under. And we want to make sure that everyone complies with that. Again, it is being done in the effort of safety so that everyone can reduce the spread of the virus as much as possible. One of the questions that we've gotten mainly this week was regarding the capacity question of 25% as it relates to what can be done in Montgomery County. And retail establishments may open provided they limit one customer for 200 square feet of in-store space or 25% occupancy, whichever is lower. And we define in-store as any space where the public or customer can be. It does not include stock rooms, back office space, or break rooms, etc. So if there are any questions regarding that information that I provide you, please put it in the chat. We're going to go through the agenda. And once we get finished, we are going to turn it over and try to answer some questions from this group. And we also want to provide you information at the end of this group, at the end of this session regarding our next meeting, which will be on December the 4th. So now at this time, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Stoddard.
Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us again. Happy to be here. I'm going to talk briefly about the ventilation and filtration guidelines that we released earlier this week. As you will recall, back in October, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention included the acknowledgement that aerosol transmission does play a role in COVID-19. The exact contribution that aerosol transmission plays relative to person-to-person contact is still not fully understood, but they did have enough confidence that aerosol transmission is a viable way of acquiring COVID-19, and it matters particularly in poorly ventilated, overcrowded spaces. So what the county has done is we've actually taken some of the recommendations put forward by ASHRAE. ASHRAE is the American Society of Heating, Refrigerating, and Air Conditioning Engineers. They are one of the premier international organizations that has put out guidelines aimed at improving ventilation and filtration in indoor spaces. We've taken their guidelines, provided some recommendations for businesses and for any operator, the county included, how to improve ventilation and filtration in indoor spaces. You can find that on the website. You can download it on the website. At this point, they are strictly guidelines. Your ability to implement them will vary between your system's age, design, and other characteristics. And we're suggesting that the first step be sort of a system assessment to determine exactly how your system is operating on a day-to-day basis, whether you're currently meeting code in terms of ventilation and filtration, and which of these options you will be able to implement, if any. To be clear, we are not expecting that all 7 of these provisions be met by every building, nor do we acknowledge that won't be possible for most buildings. The key here was to give some options for people to increase the flexibility for ventilation and filtration inside buildings. At this point, we have not linked these to sort of additional accommodations in terms of more allocations for space or more allocations for people in space. However, that is something that, as more science comes out and more research comes out, that is something that we could consider in the future, particularly as we get through the winter months and we're talking more about reopening. So you can visit our website, montgomerycounty.md.gov/COVID-19/ventilation to find these guidelines. And we've got some experts in a little bit here to talk about those, what we've recommended in generally ventilation and filtration. But first, I'd like to introduce Mr. Rick Merck. Rick is our Division Chief for Commercial Building Construction within our Department of Permitting Services. Prior to that, Rick served as the county's fire marshal and has a wealth of expertise in how we calculate fire code allowance in terms of number of individuals that are permitted to be in a location. I know we utilize the percentage base, the state utilizes percentage based occupancy, and his experience in the fire code world can help you all understand exactly how you can calculate what you're allowed to do. So with that, thank you.
Thank you, Earl. It's great to be here, everybody. Pleasure to speak with my colleagues on the topics that affect business and Montgomery County. I'm going to talk a little bit about our most current concepts and our most widely asked ideas, questions on the ideas of tents, outdoor dining, and everything that goes along with that, and then also what Dr. Earl just talked about, and talking about occupant loads. And so initially, when COVID was well into the summer, it was determined that it would make sense to be able to increase restaurants' abilities to serve the public, and that would be on the outside of the building. At that time, it was an attempt to keep people out of the direct sunlight. And of course, over time, that has changed. So we have a very quick, very comprehensive process on the website at DPS to be able to handle outdoor dining. And it is limited to outdoor dining processes. It is certification. It is very, very quick. Ultimately, there will be a site visit by certain inspectors just to verify that everything has been appropriately delineated and is safe for both the residents, the customers, and of course the folks that are in the dining facility area. And then it came to pass that there were a lot of other questions that were required about other tents. And so we just recently have put up on our website what I think is a very comprehensive document that helps people understand every other tent other than an outdoor dining tent. And so for whatever reason that someone would want to put a tent up, whether it is for large meetings, whether it's for education purposes, or anything else that would be done underneath a tent. And so we created this process. It is designed to be a 5-day approval process, which is a much different process than we've ever had before at DPS, understanding how important it is to get people to be able to increase their area of use because of the restrictions due to COVID inside the building. I will tell you that the same restrictions will also be applicable under the tent. So you are increasing the area that you have to use. What you're not doing is increasing the concentration of people. And so it doesn't matter whether inside or outside. What I typically like to say is I don't think that the COVID knows whether you're inside or outside or not, but certainly not under a tent, especially when the tent has sides, et cetera, et cetera. We understand that now that we're into cooler weather and darker weather, that there are requirements for lighting, there's requirements possibly for heating. All of those are discussed in our document online. All of those can happen. However, typically it doesn't happen the way people initially think that they can do it. Most people wish to have one of those mushroom type heaters that you might be using on your deck at home, and you might see them around. They're typically available at big box stores. Those typically are for residential use only. They are not for commercial use. Most of the manufacturers do not allow them to be used underneath a tent, and most tent manufacturers would not allow an open flame device underneath the tent. And so there's many requirements for that. Although it can be done, it is possible to keep it heated underneath a tent. and we have all the different requirements, and we're there to help people with both the electrical and the heating of the tents for use in the cold weather. Speaking with that, both heaters, lights, exit signs, egress lighting, we have moved, although the code did not necessarily include this, we have made qualifications for solar lighting, powered lighting, to be able to be used when it's very difficult to get electrical supply to a tent. So it may be remote from a building. It may or may not need a standalone generator, which would be a commercial generator. And so knowing that that might be a heavy lift for folks, we also have opportunities to be able to do all that required lighting with solar. Switching gears for a second to occupant load. Based on the code, we issue occupant load certificates only for assemblies, which is typically just large groups of people. It can be large restaurants, it can be auditoriums, it can be gymnasiums, things like that. And that's when it's above 99 patrons. That's when we issue the occupancy certificate for occupant load. We don't issue it for anything else. And so if there are no other specifics, as was discussed earlier, of 1 per 200 square feet, our rule of thumb for an occupant load for a business would be the area that you're looking at, which would be where the patrons would be, and divide that by 100. That is a rule of thumb. That is not a code-based occupant load, because occupant loads are just to design egress for being able to get people out. And with that, I'm happy to answer questions as we move forward if there are any. And I'm going to pass it back to Jerome.
Hey, thank you, Rick, and thank you for that information. I believe that there are probably going to be some questions, so thank you for hanging around. More than likely, because that is a challenging situation. I think now we want to hear from our experts who are on the phone. Are they still there, Dr. Stoddard, for us to hear from them at this point?
Yeah, so I'd like to welcome a couple special guests that we have to this town hall. First, Dr. Andrew Pursley. He comes to us from the National Institutes for Standards and Technology. He is a subject matter expert in air quality and ventilation, has been doing air quality and ventilation research since the 70s. He's actually the past vice president of the American Society of Heating, Refrigerating and Air Conditioning Engineers, ASHRAE, that we referred to. He also helped develop Ventilation Standard 62, which actually drives a lot of ventilation indoors in terms of air quality. Our other expert is Mr. Larry Schoen, who is a building services engineer consultant and air quality expert using research that began since 1995. He owns a business actually in Howard County. He's also part of ASHRAE's Airborne Infectious Disease division, or was. He was a fellow at ASHRAE as well into the environmental health, had an environmental health award, and does a lot of work in design of high performance green buildings as well. So we'll start off. I do want to say though, as a lead-in, welcome these talent. We're going to answer some questions on ventilation and filtration guidelines. Mr. Schoen and Dr. Pursley were definitely consulted in development of those guidelines. However, their comments, statements, or opinions are their own and do not reflect Montgomery County government. And specifically, Dr. Pursley from NIST, he can only speak to the research that's been conducted, his work at NIST specifically. So I want to make sure to give those caveats in the beginning. Dr. Pursley, do you want to have any opening comments before we take questions?
Sure. Thanks a lot, Chris. I'm glad I can be here and hopefully I can contribute. working at NIST, we love our neighbors, we love our county, and like to do what we can, to support Montgomery County and other local folks. I do need to confess that I'm a resident of Fairfax County, but and I haven't been in Montgomery County since April. When I went to pick up my big monitor and some cables. But hopefully I can help in the discussion based on my familiarity with ventilation and indoor air quality issues. And thanks again for inviting me.
And Mr. Schoen, do you have any opening comments?
No, I'll let the questions lead it, but just on a personal level, as you said, I live in Howard County, but my connections to Montgomery County are that I was married at Brookside Gardens in the county, and my wife grew up and was raised in Montgomery County, and my father-in-law still lives there. So I care a lot about and I have clients in the county. I care a lot about what happens there. So glad to help.
Okay, I think we're ready to take some questions then.
All right, sounds good. Thank you. Thank you both for joining us, and we welcome you to the conversation. Here's the first question that we have. So as we developed our ventilation and filtration guidance, you stressed the importance of ensuring a basic review of the building's HVAC system. Why is this so important?
Andy, you want to go first, or want me to go first?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'll go first, but you're kind of more. I think you have a better nitty-gritty answer. But if we rely on our HVAC systems to keep the buildings comfortable, to keep them, safe under normal circumstances, and we spend a lot of money, designing, installing these systems. Hopefully, spend some money maintaining them. And, without taking a look at the system, you just don't know, is it doing what you paid for? And systems don't just, run forever without anybody taking a look at things. So a key part of getting, what you paid for out of that system is to, operate it as intended and maintain it so it can perform as intended. And Larry, feel free to add to that.
Yeah, just we tend to give general. I tend to give general guidance, but it really helps to know what's going on at the system. For instance, a lot of new systems now have what's called a DOAS, a dedicated outdoor air system, which generally has a good delivery of outdoor air to every space, but doesn't usually have a lot of latitude in increasing the amount of outdoor air. The difference between what you do on a retail space with a rooftop unit, 5-ton package rooftop unit, versus a large VAV system, the way that air is delivered to each space is vastly different. And by the same token, very different if you have something like a mini split system. So you really got to know what type of system is before you know what actions are practical and possible to do within the framework of the general guidance. That's why it's important.
And I think one thing you brought up, Larry, when we were talking is that you may have an air damper that's not working correctly. It may not even be that your system is improperly designed, it just may not be functioning the way that you think it is. And so I think part of, as you said, part of the assessment is just figuring out what you're working with, both in terms of is it in good working quality? Is it at the settings that it's supposed to be at for baseline circumstances? And then what are the options that you can apply to it from what we've recommended, what the county's recommended to make it work better for COVID? And I think that's a big part of it is just, is it doing what it's supposed to do on a day-to-day basis, let alone what is it capable of doing into the future?
Exactly. Yep. I mean, in my CAM presentation that I sent you, there's a picture in there of a rooftop unit where the outside air intake isn't even installed. I'm not going to name names, but that happened to be somebody in Montgomery County who was a retailer who was complaining about odors in the space. Well, thank God we found that at that point. that's the kind of thing you wouldn't want to find right now, that you're not getting any outside air to a space.
And can you help us as the layperson understand why outside air is so critical for improving safety of inside spaces?
That's one Andy could definitely take that one, guys.
Yeah, I mean, outdoor air is important, because it removes internally generated contaminants, whether they're odors from, people's metabolism, metabolic functions, or if it's contaminants that you can't smell, but they're there, obscure chemicals coming off of materials and furnishings or whatever. And, people have been looking at how much air is needed in a building, for more than 100 years. And it's all about the health and safety and comfort of the occupants. More recently, we've been thinking about the productivity of the occupants. And there's a whole body of research about how much air is needed, and that research goes into the standards developed by ASHRAE and others, and those rates then get adopted, they get into model codes, they get adopted by your local building codes. And at that point, it's a regulation, it has the force of law, and people have to do that. But the reason, is to, to dilute internally generated contaminants. And there is research showing that if the more outdoor air you provide, to a building, or the more outdoor air you provide to an occupant, more relevant, the less health complaints, higher level of productivity, but I will caveat that with that outdoor air you provide has to be clean and dry. If you're somewhere in the heat of the heat of the humid summer, where the outdoor particle levels are high and the ozone level is high, bringing out more outdoor air into the building is not going to help the health and productivity of the occupants unless you remove that humidity, filter out those particles, and get rid of that ozone. So it's more outdoor air is better, but it's got to be clean.
I think there's a number of buildings, and you know this better space than I. There are a number of buildings where they made changes to their HVAC systems, through the LEED certification process or related to their LEED work, where they saw dramatic reductions in staff sick days, for example, as a result of it.
Yeah,
better indoor air has benefits. Again, health, comfort, and productivity. And if you just kind of like do on the back of the envelope for an office building anyway, in this country, on a per square foot basis, the salary is 100 times the energy bill. So if you do something to save a little energy, but you increase sick leave and decrease productivity, it's a losing game. Though the people who pay the utility bill aren't always the same people who pay the salary bill, who aren't necessarily the same people who operate the building. So it can get a little complicated. But the people are the most valuable resource in the building, far above the energy cost.
So let me relate it to what Andy said about the indoor, diluting indoor contaminants. In this particular case of the pandemic, we're hoping that nobody is in this space shedding virus. But if they are, that's the indoor source. That's the critical indoor source that we're trying to dilute with outdoor air that is presumed to be clean. So we're presuming that nobody is shedding virus out there next to the outdoor air intake. And why is it? Why are the numbers important? Yuguo Li was one of our colleagues in Hong Kong, investigated that famous Guangzhou restaurant incident, and he actually measured the amount of outdoor air being supplied to that space where disease was transmitted, and he got a number 1.5 to 2 CFM per person. And in the numbers that that are in the basic minimum code, even for an office building, if you use the code default numbers, you're going to get 17 CFM per person, so about 10 times as much. So if you've got a building which is operating according to the code, it's going to be an order of magnitude better than these bad situations that have been studied.
All right. The next couple of questions I have are related to the recommendations that we put out. So we included in the recommendations in our guidance that users check to ensure outside air is delivered to every space. What does that mean on a practical level, and how do you check it?
Larry, pick somebody who wants to go first. I'll take this one first. So why is that important? Because, so for instance, on a VAV system, those are variable air volume systems. Those are generally used in larger office buildings. There's a device called a VAV box, which responds to the thermostat on the wall. If the system is not set up properly, that VAV box could go to something we call full shut-off when the thermostat gets satisfied. That is not what we want to happen. And that could easily happen in an interior space. So the system in this big office building maybe have the outside air damper open, and we think we're doing great. But if you don't look at it on a room by room basis, you could be in trouble. On another type of system, a rooftop unit, there's often a thermostat on the wall that has a fan position that says fan on, fan auto. Fan auto means when the thermostat's happy, space is heated or cooled enough, the fan actually goes off. We do not want that to happen. We want to keep delivering air. We want the fan in the on position. So you can have a system that looks great on setup, but if you don't pay attention to these details, you may not be serving each room. Now, on the larger system, another way to do it is to go around with a flow hood. These are pretty portable devices. It takes a testing and balancing technician. But I have seen situations where a fire damper goes closed over the years in a building, the fusible link fails, or somebody puts partitions in, and a room, I actually used to work in a room like this, believe it or not, that they put up the partitions and they didn't put an air supply into my room. So if that's the case, and let's say I've got a visitor in my room and one of us is shedding virus and the other one is not infected, that's a perfect situation, perfect in the bad way, for the infected person to infect the susceptible person.
All right, so we have a question that I'm going to throw in here from the audience that relates to this topic. And the question is, does the volume of air have an impact on the risk of viral transmission? For instance, does a 10,000 square foot room with a 10-foot ceiling represent the same risk as a 10,000 square foot room with a 30-foot ceiling?
You want me to go
Andy,
first on this?
Yeah, you go first.
Larry?
That's a steady state.
Yeah.
That's a steady state question.
Well, we look at spaces, and a larger space kind of has a bigger volume, it's a bigger buffer, it's more, more air for whatever bad thing, to dilute in. But, the person or the people breathe where their noses are, and the contaminants are where the contaminants are going to be. And it can get pretty complicated. You're looking at the distribution of the contaminant in the space and the variation in concentration by location, and that can get really complicated. And you're almost getting into the realm of research, and people, you don't have time and resources to turn this into a research project into, each of your spaces. A larger space, higher ceiling, there's more, I guess, buffering volume, and that can be helpful. But you know, it kind of gets back to an earlier point Larry made, and I think a response to an earlier question. You know, you really got to look at the space and the system, you know, understand how it's supposed to be working and how you might expect the air to move, and you may have to engage, you know, an engineer in those discussions so that you know, make a, you know, reasonable plan of attack. And, you know, there is no one size fits all, you know, solution. You know, I mean, do you have a mechanical system? Are you relying only on windows? You know, how, and so you know, you really have to look at the building of the space and its unique features, you know, to really consider all those issues. And I don't know if I set you up, Larry, in a good way or a bad way.
Well, Andy, wouldn't it be fair to say that, as you said, the buffer, that if I had a restaurant with the same number of people and one of them had a 10-foot ceiling and one had a 20-foot ceiling, that if the people were in there constantly, that buffer would only help me at the very beginning, and eventually I'm going to have the same concentration inside the room. And furthermore, if the transmission is direct person to person, the height of the ceiling isn't going to do anything at all. Wouldn't that be fair to say?
Yeah. I mean, if you have the higher ceiling, you know, you may end up in the same place. You got to look at, see how much air you're supplying per person. And, you know, a lot of that is second order stuff. But, you know, while we want to provide, you know, sufficient ventilation and maybe a little bit more than sufficient, you know, if you're sitting, you know, next to a person who's ill and coughing, and you're neither of you are wearing a mask, ventilation is not the answer to that one, right? You've got to, ideally that sick person isn't in there. Ideally people are wearing masks, and you're not going to solve that, you know, close proximity question with ventilation. And some people talk about a layered approach or a tiered approach, where you manage the people, you manage their actions, you know, you manage the distribution of where people are, and you manage the ventilation, and you do all of those. You know, no single one of those all by itself is going to, you know, solve, you know, reduce the risk to, you know, sufficiently.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you're referring to, Andy, is I think we call it the Swiss cheese model, where no system is perfect, but if you layer one piece of Swiss cheese one after the other, eventually you've got a more impermeable space that, you know, you're more protective against the virus or whatever issue you're dealing with by putting, you know, multiple imperfect layers one back to back. I would actually, you know, in thinking about this question, I would think that there would be, you know, we always say the solution to pollution is dilution, so more airspace, but obviously you're getting, you know, it's not like you're introducing virus one time and you're, you know, it dilutes into the space per se, the steady state thing you brought on. You're having multiple reintroductions based on the person being in the room for however long they're in the room. But also, I would think that as you increase the air volume, the amount of effort taken to do an air change in the room also increases, right? So it's sort of a more complicated situation. And I'm asking that more than making it as a statement.
I'm not sure I understand, but you're saying as the room gets bigger or the ceiling gets higher, it's more involved if you're aiming for an air change to get that air change. Is that what you're saying, Chris?
Your system has to move more air and replace more air to get a full change of the air in the room, because there's more air volume.
Sure. If your target is a specific air change rate, you know, yeah, the bigger the volume, the more air you need to get that air change rate. You know, if your target is based, you know, on CFM per person, you know, then it's really the number of people, you know. But when you have a high ceiling, you know, you can get, you can get stratification, you can get some more complex airflow patterns, which can, under some circumstances, make delivery of that CFM per person just more challenging to get it to the person. You know, getting it into the room is step one. Getting it to where the person's doing their breathing, you know, that's a real important step two. So, bigger spaces can be more complicated, but they can also, I think historically, long historically, and an architect could answer this better than me, but, older buildings had some pretty high ceilings so that the warmer air could, go up to the top and generate some breezes and make people more complicated. And that's, but that's kind of more of an architectural historian thing. But we're seeing more kind of people going back to the old approaches. But before I talk myself into a corner, I'll let Larry,
Well,
pipe
so
in.
Andy said, totally agree with Andy that it depends on what your target is. And the air changes per hour target, in my experience, comes from the healthcare world. For some reason, they got hooked on that particular measure. My opinion is that's the wrong measure. The measure is the other one that Andy mentioned, which is CFM per person. Why? Because the person, if there's a certain chance of a certain number of people being infected, the people are the source of the contaminant for infectious disease. And by the same token, the people are also the recipient of those contaminants. So to me, CFM per person is a far more meaningful number than air changes per hour. And second, I want to push back a little bit on the solution to pollution is dilution. That is the second less desirable solution to pollution. The first one for any pollution situation is to avoid the contamination to begin with. Yaglu, who's one of our oldest reference in indoor air quality, he said, remove the pile of feces from the room before you start to try to dilute it away. The analogy today is the person who has any chance of being sick should stay home, not be the source in the space. And then we want to do for the ones that don't know or somehow can't stay out, then you do dilution ventilation.
And I think that gets to the point of ventilation and filtration are not a substitute for doing the other things that we've talked about, limiting density, other things like that. And so I think that totally agree with that statement.
If this is Andy, I have one other thought that it's kind of one of my pet issues these days, just to remind everybody that if a space is, operating at 1 air change an hour, it does not mean that all the air is replaced in an hour. What it means is that one volume of air enters every hour, but the stuff that leaves is a mix of old air that's been there a while and some of the newer air. So I don't want to get exponential on you, but it's kind of it's a percentage thing. And if you have 1 air change an hour and the space is pretty well mixed, an hour into that, about, what is it, Larry, 63% of the air will get replaced?
I don't do math on the fly, but it sounds
me neither. Yeah, me neither. It will, but just bear in mind, and I see this in the popular press, voiced by people who should know better. 1 air change an hour doesn't mean all the air is gone in an hour. It just means that much air is moved in, it mixes, and the stuff that leaves is a mix of new air and old. And we can talk about that some other day if we really want to get into it.
No, that was great. That was a great answer and great dialogue. Let me just try to get you guys out on this question right here. It seems like every day we learn a little bit more. Could you share a couple of the nuggets learned so far this pandemic from maybe around the world regarding ventilation and filtration that you would like the audience to know?
There are so many, this is Andy, there are so many research papers being published. I can't keep up, and do my job, one important thing, and Larry mentioned this earlier, is those spaces, where significant transmission events have occurred and where they took a look at the ventilation, most of those studies have shown that the ventilation is darn low, you know, and I mean, that's encouraging. That kind of supports the argument for keeping the ventilation rate at a design level or a recommended level from a standard. So I think on the ventilation front, you know, that's a big important takeaway, you know. I don't know if you have any other thoughts on that, Larry.
Just totally agree. I mean, the spaces where the transmission events happen tended to have something very, as you said, very low ventilation rates, poor filtration, people unmasked and close to each other. And I guess the other item is vocal projection. The famous Guangzhou restaurant that I mentioned before, that was Chinese New Year. I've been to those events. People are happy. They're vocally projecting. The choir event in the Northwest, obviously vocal projection. The bus event going to the Buddhist retreat in China. Yeah, people probably yelling over the noise of the bus. The meat packing incidents, industrial machinery loud, people probably needing to project their voice. I haven't seen this in the research, but I'm inferring people needing to work closely and project their voice over the noise of machinery. So yes, low ventilation, bad filtration, things we want to avoid. Vocal projection is something we want to avoid. And the mask is a good thing, and don't yell at each other is the other.
Larry, I saw in some of the exchange we had in email, and this is something before you had mentioned it in the email, we've been looking at too, is the role of humidity in this whole situation. Do you have anything on that front that you think is worth talking about?
Yeah. I mean, humidity does play some role, but I think we're now, in my opinion, we're now down in the weeds. You know, if the first actions are social distancing, masking, and don't yell at each other, and the next one is have some decent ventilation and filtration, and don't yell at each other, then humidity is like farther down, and I don't think it should distract us from the more important things. I greatly admire Lindsay Moore. She's a great aerosol scientist. She's a mom, and I can't say enough good things about her. I just happen to disagree a little bit on the importance of humidity. I don't think she's seen some of the things that I and some of my colleagues have seen about the downsides of putting humidity, deliberately putting moist air into buildings, especially as we get into the cold weather. And those can have effect on people's respiratory systems as well. And that's not something we want to encourage. So, and I haven't read the underlying research there, but I think it's further down into the weeds, the humidity. Andy, do you have anything you can share about that?
No, I have no other thoughts on that one. I mean, humidity, humidification of buildings is not, is complicated stuff. You know, it's not something you can just do at the spur of the moment. Even if you have the capability, it has to be taken real seriously. And we know, that buildings with moisture problems have, the occupants have higher rates of health effects, and we don't want to. And I know Lindsay doesn't want to encourage that either. It's just something you got to be really, really careful with. That's all I'd add.
So how is this playing out? So I have a client who, it's actually your county, another jurisdiction, and right after that article came out, they said to me, we have somebody who wants to bring in their own humidifier in their office. Should we let everybody do that? So now, boy, that's going to be such a tough one to handle, because now you're talking about uncontrolled humidification of the building. My personal opinion is a lot more downsides in that than any potential benefit we could get from controlling disease transmission.
All right, great answers for that question. Thank you, Dr. Stoddard, for asking that one. And I don't see any more questions here in the chat, so let me thank Dr. Stoddard and Rick Merck from our Department of Permitting Services, as well as Dr. Persili and Larry Sherwin for that exchange of information. I think the audience found it very valuable. We do appreciate your time. We know it's valuable, and I love the I can't figure that out while I'm working at the same time sort of line. It's tough. Yes.
Let me just add, Dr. Persili and Mr. Schoen, obviously, I've said this before. I thank you very much. They provided this guideline, this conversation totally, pro bono. It's, we're not paying them for this guidance or work. This was something they just cared enough about to work with us based on a request. So I think it, speaks very well for them to be willing to put themselves out there and participating in something like that. And so I just want to say thank you one more time.
You're very welcome, Chris. I'm paid by the taxpayers, so you did pay for me, and NIST is a federal agency residing in Montgomery County. Always happy where we can, work together, to meet your goals based on our technical expertise. So it's happy to devote the time to this effort.
And I'm glad to do it just because it's an area that interests me. As I said, I care a lot about what happens in Montgomery County, and a lot of us around the world are doing our own parts of what we can do. And this, I mentioned colleagues in Hong Kong. There are colleagues in China who are co-publishing papers. Regardless of what our politicians say, the worldwide engineering and science community is working together on this in a very cooperative manner. Andy, I'm sure you'd agree with that as well. Yeah, I'm not to put you on the spot. Okay. We're all working together. That's the message.
There you go. And again, I echo the thanks and appreciation as my colleague did. As we wait to see if there's any more questions that are going to arrive, let me just do a few housekeeping issues. The other question that was in the chat was, is this going to be recorded? And just like the first one, the same link that you used to get into this session, you can use it for 90 days after this session. It will be live for those who may want to share it with others or revisit it for information. Also be on the lookout for an email from Ellen Cornelius. She is going to give you the link to the grants that I referenced earlier in the beginning, as well as a survey. We do want to hear from you as the audience and figure out a way of how we can make this exchange the most productive use of everyone's time. Our goal is to address this group and provide as much helpful information to as many as possible at the same time, but we also want to ensure that it is a two-way conversation. We want to hear from you just as much as we want you to hear from us. The next meeting will take place not on next Friday, since it is the day after Thanksgiving. That's why we moved this bi-weekly meeting to this Friday today. Our next meeting will be on Friday, December the 4th. You will get an agenda and some information prior to that meeting so that we can make it, again, another productive use of our time. And let me check one more time for any questions from the audience. And I don't see any. So I will thank everyone for participating. Dr. Stoddard, thanks again. Everyone who made this video and session possible. Thank you, John. Thank you to our IT team. Thank you to Mitra. Thank you to Ellen. Thank you to Ryan. Thank you, everybody who is within earshot. You know who you are. It is greatly appreciated. So please, I'm channeling my inner Dr. Gales here and telling everyone, please be safe. Don't take any unnecessary risks. We are at a very critical moment in time with this particular pandemic. Let's make sure we do the right thing so that we can enjoy Christmas and the other upcoming holidays in the safest manner possible.
We have a lot of testing available. Go out and get tested. County sites, we're doing extra of them over the next several days. Please take a bit, don't have to be symptomatic and come in, just get a test and have peace of mind if you're gonna, with your family for Thanksgiving.
There you go. Thank you, Dr. Stoddard. All right. Thank you, everyone. Have a great weekend.